The next pattern that Rails provides for sort of cross-cutting concerns are what we call controller filters. So there's a bunch of common experiences that we might have. How might we ensure in an application that requires a user to be logged in that they are always logged in? Would it make sense for every single controller action to say, assert that some user is logged in before continuing on? Controller filters provide a way to handle this once in our application that sets up the world, asserts some condition. If it's not true, perhaps redirects the user. We might do things like, if we have some internal routes, things like admin pages, how might we assert that only a user who is an administrator can access those particular pages? Controller filters, again, provide a way of sort of blocking access only when some particular condition is met. They also do something which you might have already seen before, depending on how you set up your application, which is controller filters also provide a way to set up shared functionality before all the actions continue. So we'll explore that one because it's also a pretty common pattern. So in modern Rails, the function that you call is before action with a colon and the function name as a symbol. So again, typical Ruby pattern here. Before action is just, again, a function built into Rails. Its arguments are a function name as a symbol, and optionally some stuff that we'll see like conditional arguments as well. Because this is an object-oriented design, these before actions inherit. So if we define an action in our application controller, and we have movies controller, which should inherit from application controller, we will inherit all of those before actions. And this is what's really nice about using object-oriented programming, in sort of its proper form, is that if we set something up once in our app controller, each movie controller will see a reviews controller later on. These things get to inherit that behavior. I mentioned an example before of administrator actions. You might set up an administrator controller, which inherits from your application controller. And you might further have something like a user's administrator controller, which, again, inherits from that. So they provide a way of setting up a tree. One note, in Rails before versions 5, they called this before filter, so that's something you'll still see. The reason that this was changed to before action is because filters don't always have to stop execution. More often than not, actually, you will have ones that just set up some state about the world. Controller actions are taken for our routes, so we still call them controller filters, but the function that we write in our code is now called before action. We're not going to use it today, but if there is a before action, you can also assume, that there is an after action, which Rails will execute just before rendering. So what do we do in these filter methods? Well, they operate a lot like regular controller methods. They have access to everything that exists in our controller, so they can set instance variables, they can pass data to the flash or the session hashes, and they provide functionality like doing things like redirecting the user to a new route. And again, there's a whole set of built-in types of actions that you can use, and all of the lifecycle callbacks that exist for actions are also defined in the Rails guide. A first example that we might have seen that just sets data, this is what I would say is sort of the simplest version, is when we scaffold a controller now in Rails, we get this by default. We have before action, set movie, and here we see an optional argument that Rails actually uses by default, only. So this is telling us only on these particular routes should I run this before action. So show, edit, update, and destroy. Essentially, what are we skipping? We're skipping things like the index route or the new route. And why would we do that? Well, we don't have a particular movie on those routes, so we wouldn't want to run this particular action. But we call set movie. We have, and this just sets up our instance variable. At movie is equal to movie.find params ID. So fairly typical controller action here, where we just set up the variable once, but we call this function before we render our show, before we render edit, update, and destroy. And so this is a pretty common pattern. We'll also see things like require login, which will assert perhaps that a user exists, or require administrators or things like that.